So, welcome everybody. I am Glenn Hicks and I am the coordinator of Young Humanists in the UK. I'm not Laura Denton, who you might have seen on the event promo and was meant to be chairing the event today. Unfortunately, something has come up and she can't make it, but I will do my very best to fill in for her. Tonight's event is hosted by Humanist students who are the student section of Humanist UK. It exists to support and represent a growing membership of non-religious students on campuses everywhere in the UK. So we support student activists working to secure human rights, equality, secularism and free expression. We support lasting change for a better society and championing the ideas for the one life we have. As I mentioned earlier, I'm filling in for Laura, but I specifically look after Young Humanists. We are the kind of older sibling of Humanist students for the 18 to 35 age group, but we work really, really closely with them and are kind of co-hosting this event tonight as well. So welcome everybody. Before we get started and I introduce our speakers, I'll go over some kind of admin and ground rules. So the structure of today's event is that we will hear some opening remarks from each of our speakers for the first kind of 20 minutes, half an hour. And then we will open the discussion up to audience Q&A, which I'll help moderate. So please use the chat if you have any questions. You can ask questions throughout and we'll come to them at the end. Let us know if it's directed at a particular person on the panel or just to the panel generally. And we will do the best to pick those up. And then normal Zoom rules apply, so please stay on mute. Don't go taking your laptop to the toilet with you with the camera on, and please be respectful in the chat. We've got Julian, our events manager, keeping a close eye on the chat, and he's got the sacred power of ejecting people at will, though I'm sure he won't need to use it. Likewise, if you've got any issues or concerns or your tech's not working or something like that, then drop Julian Webb a private message in the chat, and he will do his best to help. So, what are we talking about? Tonight's event is how to make the world a better place, humanist campaigning and how you can help. So from decriminalising abortion in Northern Ireland or abolishing blasphemy laws in England and Wales to banning creationism in schools and providing non-religious pastoral care in the NHS, Humanist UK and the wider humanist movement have had plenty of campaigning successes. But there are many battles yet to win, including legal recognition of humanist marriage in England and Wales, ending state funding for alternative medicines, and ongoing defences of free speech in universities. So tonight we are hearing from 3 experienced campaigners on past successes and future challenges for humanists who want to make a difference. We will also discuss the steps that we can take to all get involved and support humanist campaigns and make our voices heard. So we've got 3 fabulous speakers tonight, so I will give a brief introduction to them all and then we can hear from them. So first up we have Andrew Copson, who has been the Chief Exec of Humanist UK since 2010 and, as you would expect, is our expert on humanism and has written widely on the subject, including in his Sunday Times bestseller book, the Little Book of Humanism, which is co-authored with the President of Humanist UK, Professor Alice Roberts, available in all good bookstores, might I say. And as well as that role of Humanist UK, Andrew is a trustee of the Religious Education Council and president of Humanists International. Welcome, Andrew. We also have Audrey Simmons. So Audrey comes from a Seventh-day Adventist background, which she left several years ago and is now with us in the Humanists. And at present, she is a coordinator for the Association of Black Humanists and a volunteer with Face to Faceless, one of the programs that Humanists UK run with people who have left religion. She is also a wedding celebrant with Humanist UK and a freelance sign language interpreter. Welcome, Audrey. And then finally, we have Jamie Winder. So Jamie is an award-winning LGBTQI+ editor, writer, model, and public speaker. They are the founder of Fruitcake magazine, as well as a contributing editor at Gay Times, where their focus is to highlight the reality and joy of the LGBTQ+ community. They've spoken at TEDx London, and as a model, they've worked with the likes of Gucci, UGG, ASOS, and London Fashion Week. And not content to stop there with all those things, Jamie's debut book, which is called In Their Shoes, Navigating Non-Binary Life, is out tomorrow and takes a humorous yet nourishing look at what it is like to navigate the world as a trans person. Welcome, Jamie. So that is our three fabulous speakers. So I'm going to shut up now and hand over to Andrew, who's going to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Glenn. I'm sorry that Laura can't be here, but I think I will start off with some talk about Humanist UK's campaigning, and then when other speakers have spoken, try to lead a bit of the discussion then as well in her place. So I've been asked to talk about the historical successes of humanist campaigns, and also something about our current priorities. Next year is the 125th anniversary of Humanist UK. We've been around a very long time, but in that time we've been remarkably consistent, which is that our policies and the change that we've advocated for has fallen in those 125 years pretty broadly into two categories. So in one category, we've had the work that we've been doing for secularism, for equality, and for human rights. So that's about ensuring that in the state that we live in its laws, in its policies, and in wider society where social policy touches our lives, there should be no discrimination based on religion or belief. Everyone should have the maximum possible human rights within the rights of others, so up to the rights, the limits of the rights and freedoms of others, and that there should be equal treatment on all grounds of people by the state and by our laws regardless. So secularism, human rights, and equality. And the other half of our campaigning agenda has been more about big ethical issues, either of individual and personal choice. So for example, bioethical issues like sexual reproductive health rights, abortion has been the most important of those we've just heard, or life and death issues like assisted dying for the terminally ill, which has been one of our longest running campaigns. We've been working on that for almost 100 years now. So that combination of secularist, equality, human rights type campaigns, which if you want to see it that way, are for the benefit of all people. And then the second category of trying to bring a particularly specifically humanist perspective to some of the big ethical issues of our times is the way that our agenda has always divided. Now, although our principles have never changed, the reality to which we've applied them has changed immeasurably over 125 years, and so the particular issues that we've been active on have transformed over that time. So, for example, we were very involved in the decriminalisation of male homosexuality in the mid-20th century, very involved in the liberalisation of divorce laws, very involved in the decriminalisation of abortion. In all three of those cases, the campaigns for change were led within Parliament and outside by humanists, and in many cases by humanist organisations as well. More recently, we've been highly involved in rolling out that progress and expanding that progress in freedom of choice across the UK and across the world. And that's been probably one of the most important developments of the last few decades, has been the expansion of our campaigns from Britain to internationally, because after all, if you believe in human rights and the human rights of all people, regardless of any characteristics they might have, then you're going to have, to some extent, a global vision. And so over time, our horizons have expanded in that respect. So we've moved from seeking, for example, to decriminalise abortion, homosexuality, and introduce equality laws domestically into wanting to see those things internationally as well. So we're as active almost now in the UN institutions and in our contributions to Humanist International as we are within the parliamentary arrangements of the UK. So in terms of the ethical and human rights-based campaigning that we've conducted, we've achieved many advances, but the biggest advances that we've achieved, and this is the first thing I want to say about how to campaign, have been ones that we've worked to achieve in coalition with others. And these days, I think that coalition working is the best way to achieve change. Single issue campaigns can sometimes be very strong, but they're strongest when they make use of existing networks of connection between organizations, between movements, between individuals. A good example of that coming up at the moment is the government's plan to amend, probably to dilute, the human rights law in the UK. In the last few months, we've been working at Humanist UK to bring together a coalition on that issue, and it's been quite incredible the way that by stating as an ambition that you want to build a coalition, you can reach beyond your existing boundaries, your existing supporters, your existing networks, and reach new people. So, for example, although we're very used to working with religion or belief groups, we've been able to add to that coalition big national organizations like the RNIB, the Howard League for Penal Reform, other organizations that are household names in order to bring them into the coalition. And that's, I think, the first thing that I wanted to encourage everybody to think about when they're thinking about wanting to change the world. Who else is interested in this too? Where else can I find allies? Who can I reach out to? Where are the possible partners, not just as individuals, but as organizations for that change? The second thing I think you have to do is you have to win the argument before you can win the change. 125 years ago, Humanist UK was seen as highly eccentric. The people who were involved in it were extremely unusual. They weren't religious for a start, which was pretty strange in the late 19th century, at least to popular opinion. They were obsessed with things like the rights of homosexuals and of women to choice. These things were eccentric. All their opinions were eccentric. But over the course of the decades, by advancing the arguments that they advanced, they were able to influence not just the policy changes that were the eventual fruits of their campaigning work, but on the way they won the argument. They made the argument for personal freedom, for individual choice, for equality, for the idea of equal human dignity. And I think that that's the second thing that I want to say about campaigning. If you want to see a policy change, stand back from it and ask yourself, is there a bigger argument that I need to win in our wider culture in order to get to where I want to be in terms of the specific policy change? And then the third thing I want to say is that when you've identified that argument that you need to win, that bigger cultural point, address it in the context of wider culture. Don't just say, I want to decriminalize abortion. This is an example. I want to decriminalize abortion. Don't just say that. Say, I want to have women recognized as human beings with the same rights over their bodies as other human beings, or deduce those other abstract arguments that you might want to deduce. Another example of that is Humanist UK was very involved in the early 20th century with decolonization and the campaigns for withdrawing European governments from Africa and from Asia. And they were against that from the beginning of colonialism, from the beginning, in the late 19th century. But they didn't get straight into the campaigns of decolonization. They concentrated on concepts of racial equality. So, for example, the Humanists organized the first Universal Race Congress in 1911 in London, which was the first global anti-racism meeting. And that was one of the things that led eventually to a different conception amongst some people, not everyone, unfortunately, of the people of the world. Of human dignity, of the nature of the human being. Just another example of drawing back from the policy change you want to see, considering the big picture and asking yourself, what cultural change do I need to implement to make that happen? What argument do I need to win? And then the fourth thing I want to say is that once you've achieved your policy change, you need to lock it in forever, or as long as you can, as a human mind can plausibly predict anyway. And it's worth considering that at the beginning of your campaign. The Human Rights Act is a good example of a policy change that has attempted to lock in its the progress that it represents forever. We were very involved in that coalition. As I say, we're now part of building a coalition to defend the Human Rights Act. The Human Rights Act is a good example of this because let's just imagine a campaigner has been alive for 100 years. It's an imaginary campaigner who represents all the campaigning organizations and movements that brought the Human Rights Act about. But let's imagine that she exists. So there she is. And she's thinking, I want to achieve a situation in the UK where policy always has to respect the human rights of individuals across all of the state's activities. She sets out at the beginning. She notices that the concept of human rights is not universally acknowledged, so she sets out to win the argument about that, and you can see that happened over the decades. Then you have to achieve the precise policy change, and it was a matter of persuading the Labour Party in the 1980s and 1990s that there should be a law in the UK that gave legal definition to the human rights of all people within the UK. But it doesn't stop there, because the third thing that, for example, a development like the Human Rights Act does is it locks in that progress forever by saying, as it does in the Human Rights Act, everything that happens from now on in our country, every law that is passed has to be compatible with the Human Rights Act, has to be compatible with human rights. So that's just an example of a mechanism whereby you can attempt to lock progress in the long term. So identify the change you want to see in policy terms, draw back from it, ask yourself who else is concerned to go in the same direction, join up with them, identify the culture change that you need to achieve in order to bring the policy objective about, win the argument, combine the cultural change with a concrete policy outcome, and then find a way of locking in that progress over the long term. That's the experience, I think, of the way that Humanist UK and its allies have over the last 125 years fought and won on things like banning creationism in schools, on things like abolishing blasphemy laws and censorship laws across the UK, on things like decriminalising abortion, on things like liberalising divorce laws. All the achievements that we've had, bringing the Human Rights Act in, bringing equality law in, on all the protected characteristics, where we've worked with broad coalitions of organisations across civil society, they've all been won in those stages, and I think that's the way that you have to do it.
Amazing, thank you, Andrew. All very easy, I'm sure, but good to hear that the humanists were always on the right side of history, almost always. Audrey, over to you. So tell us a bit about the campaign work that you've been involved in.
Hi, thank you for inviting me tonight. The campaign work, we don't, I mean, Association of Black Humanists and the Faith to Faithless are kind of smaller, and so the kind of, we don't work on that kind of global scale. But I think the kind of things that we kind of look at are not just changing, just trying to win arguments, not approaching people and trying to decide that you're going to change minds. It's really about trying to change, trying to be the change that you are. So the kind of things that we've been doing, we work in coalition, and Andrew was saying working with other organisations. And for us, it's vital, whether you're working with Faith to Faithless or any other organisation, because, you know, one person can't really change anything. You can just link with other organisations who have other contacts, who have other perspectives, who have, you know, other people. So we been working with Leo Igwe in terms of looking at Bala. If anyone doesn't know him, he has he's a Nigerian humanist running Humanist Nigeria, and he was recently arrested. I say recently, it was in April, and we've only just managed to get contact with any kind of legal team. He was hidden away. No one's quite sure where he has been. So it's been a national campaign, and many organisations, and I know Humanist UK, Humanist International, and other African organisations as well have been involved in kind of trying to make the world know, just that message. Look what has happened. Look at this. This is what's happened. Yeah, and for people to go, well, actually, that wouldn't happen anywhere else. This doesn't seem to be right, because everyone understands the concept of people having law and having legal representation, of being able to see their family even though they're in maybe in jail, and all of those things. We all understand that, and for those things to be denied. So I think you have to build empathy when people understand what it is that you're trying to achieve, and realize that if those things aren't happening for me and they're not happening for other people, then clearly something is wrong. And so some of the, so we've been doing certain things like that. I think it's harder for us because we're trying to kind of build an idea of just trying to change individuals. We come from, when you're looking at blasphemy, when you're looking at apostasy, those kinds of ideas of people who have left religion, you're dealing with small communities, you're dealing with people who are just in their family communities, they're just in their local communities. And so it's about approaching people and not trying to kind of, you have to behave as we do, but it's about trying to gain empathy, to understand that when people leave, they're still good people, and what does good look like? And it's about presenting your arguments in a way that taps into who are the other people that you're trying to work with? What common grounds can you be working with? So, and when you're dealing with conservative religions, as we do in parts of Faith to Faithless, when you're dealing with conservative Muslims, when you're dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses, you can't go in trying to sort of say you're wrong and we're right. What you have to kind of do is identify where you go, what things that you can talk about, where you can actually be involved with people. So again, we've been working with as Association of Black Humanists, we've been working with other organisations. As Faith to Faithless, we've been working with, I know I've been done some work with the police. We did some training with the police, and I know the Faith to Faithless has been doing stuff, working with social services so that they can recognise what it is, what does an apostate look like, what arguments are they going to make, how are they going to present, and when you can do things when on a kind of community level, so that an individual can go in and say, this is what my situation is, and then get the support, then you can start to kind of build from that. And I know recently, for Faith to Faithless, Imtiaz was part of Race Hate Week. It was National Hate Crime Week last week, and Imtiaz was involved in that as well. And so as part of Faith to Faithless, you're really looking at that kind of grassroots level that you're trying to get people involved in, so that they can then you can then start to work out from that idea of an individual, of a community, and start to build out to kind of gain those grounds that you need. I hope that makes sense. Kind of just working on that kind of grassroots level. And I think that works well when we're looking at what Humanist UK do in the kind of more global sense, and then when the smaller organisations like Faith to Faithless are trying to do with Humanist UK support, is trying to work on that more individual, that smaller level of individuals who are looking for support, looking support from the community, and they're working with those kind of the kind of wider community and organisations such as the police, such as the NHS, such as those organisations that then you can sort of work from the inside out to kind of support all the individuals that will go there. And so that we have this two-way of, the border laws, but also those individuals as well, supporting them so that they can then live the life that they want.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Audrey. We'll now go on to our final speaker, Jamie, who, as I said earlier, is a big campaigner in the LGBTQ space. So Jamie, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for context, I am coming into this conversation from, I guess you could say, an outside perspective, as it were, as someone who is an observer of humanist practices and observer of kind of the way in which humanists work. But my campaigning started from a space of looking at the world that I live in and a lot of LGBTQ plus people live in, and it came from frustration. And I think a lot of people around me that work in this type of campaigning space, their work and the reasons why they get into this type of work is because they are frustrated. And I think often that can be a good motivating factor in trying to promote and provoke change. But, to kind of go off what Andrew said, I think no one person can do this on their own. It has to be a collaborative project, and it has to exist through all of the channels of allies that you know. So for me personally, I worked on a campaign that for me was at the time was very important to me, and it is still important to me now, but my thought and feelings have evolved on it. So I campaigned to try and, or co-campaigns to try and allow in the UK for us to have X passports, which are passports that do not, essentially is the third option on gender on a passport. But essentially kind of that was a stepping stone to then move into, we don't need it on a passport. It's not necessary to have gender markers or sex markers on passports. And I think at the moment now, during that campaign, it was very much me on my own, asking people, because I work in the media, asking people for favors, asking people to try and get as much exposure as possible. And kind of all of that fueled by my frustration and my anger towards what was going on, which, it got to where it got to, and the Parliament basically decided that they didn't want to continue with it. But I think now what's more important with campaigning is that during that whole process, no matter how you start campaigning, that you are continually open to having your campaign analysed by other people and having it open to feedback. Because I think if you completely close yourself off from it, and it's easily done because often the things that we're campaigning about are very personal to us, so we can kind of get very tunnel visioned into what we, you know, what we want, and we can see the goal that we want, and we, you know, no one's going to stop us from getting there, which is fine, and determination is great. But I think it's important to be open to other people's opinions on what your campaign looks like and what the actual end goal of the campaign is. And for example, in me, that has now kind of moved me now into a space where I've realized that actually, although legal protections are important, and for example, the Human Rights Act has very recently in September allowed non-binary people to be, and trans people, because I identify as trans, to be protected from workplace discrimination, which is completely new, and that's great, and that will help a lot of non-binary and trans people. Looking at the specifics of my campaign and allowing kind of the government to have a record of who's trans and who's not trans and people's genders, inherently now I feel that that actually isn't necessary. And I think it often can be more dangerous for a lot of people to have their, you know, it's quite a personal thing about them, and something that they feel so passionate about logged in the system. A lot of people actually came back to me with that feedback that actually, you know, this is an issue, but we don't feel that that's necessarily the answer. And it was that criticism and, you know, not criticism, but kind of feedback and analysis of what I was doing that made me actually realize, do you know what, there is something bigger here. Like Andrew said again, there's something bigger that we need to tackle here. And that is institutional bias. That is institutional and institutional transphobia in that space. So I'm grateful for that. And I think if you are constantly open to learning about how you can essentially attack the bigger picture, then that's a win-win. Currently, I'm not doing any more campaigns because I don't have the time and I can't truly be bothered. But I will, like, you know, in a way, it's more fun and easier to join other campaigns, to kind of get on board, especially for me as a trans person, to kind of join a campaign and showcase a new voice or a new kind of way of thinking of a campaign that some people may not have thought of before, or the experience that a lot of people might not have thought of on that specific campaign. For example, a campaign like that is about trans people and sanitary products. You know, a lot of people were advocating for this what they saw as a very gendered item for women. Whereas, you know, when you bring trans people into that discussion, actually they realize that a lot of trans people that aren't women use products that are marketed towards women. So I think advice on that front would be always think of who you want to include in this campaign, bring them in, listen to them, and then your campaign will be stronger than ever.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Jamie. So we will now open up for questions. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask members of the panel, then do type them in the chat and we will get to them. But I just wanted to kick off with kind of something which Jamie mentioned about kind of running out of energy to be in a campaign, or, you know, the day job takes over. Maybe starting with you, Andrew, kind of given Humanists UK have been running campaigns for over 100 years, though not the same individual, I'm sure.
Feels like it sometimes.
How do you kind of maintain kind of the longevity of a campaign? Because often it can be thankless talking into the void as you know, do the slow work of convincing people to your opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't know that you'll live to see the positive outcome. You know, there's a lot of trust in campaigning in that sort of way. You've got to trust and hope for a better future, as well as working for one. And, you know, it's sort of the hoping that it will happen that can propel you forwards to actually do the work, you know, if you're optimistic about that. But you know that it might never happen in your lifetime. That's true. There are lots of different ways that people have tried to mitigate against that sort of depression, pessimism, lack of vim that comes with when you're not instantly successful. You know, you can it's so easy to feel beaten and depressed and sort of hopeless when you're involved in a campaign and it doesn't happen, especially if you're really close. I mean, I've had some experiences where I've been really, really close. You know, I remember humanist marriage, legal humanist marriage in England and Wales failed in the House of Commons by one vote. You know, one vote brought to an end 19 years of campaigning. One vote. That Liberal Democrat lost his seat, I'm happy to say, in the general election that followed in 2015. But one vote, and you know, and that can really, it's just so it can feel so arbitrary and unfair. So people try to mitigate it in different ways. First of all, obviously, you've got to keep yourself healthy, and I'm conflicted about this because you get some people who are completely obsessed and single-minded, have tunnel vision towards their campaigning ends and achieve loads as a result. Peter Tatchell is an example. But you know, no one would say that Peter had like a full and luxurious life apart from his campaigning work. You know, he is a campaigner, that's who he is, and it keeps him going. But people like Peter Tatchell are rare. Most people need to maintain a healthy other life as well, and I think that's really important, to keep yourself healthy, well balanced, take time off, take time away, don't invest everything you have, you know, emotionally in just one campaign. Care for yourself. Just as you should also care for your allies in the campaign, and actually by caring for each other in that way, you can build the strength, the common strength, the shared strength, the joint resilience to move campaigns forward. So I think that you must care for yourself. I think the other way of mitigating the inevitability of failure, because failure is inevitable, you're never going to 100% succeed every single thing you wanted on the schedule that you wanted it. I think to mitigate that as well, I'm a great believer personally in organization building, in institution building. You know, I think that it's really good that Humanist UK exists as an organization, that Amnesty International exists as an organization, that the Howard League for Penal Reform, you know, just to take three quite different sectors, exist as an organization, because they can sustain themselves across the generations, but with a consistent platform over that time. So I think organization building is very important too. And again, just like saying you should be a well-balanced person doesn't detract from the achievements of Peter Tatchell. I don't mean that Peter's not well-balanced. He's a good friend, you know, I'm not criticizing him, but you know what I mean? Just as saying that doesn't detract from him. I don't think that saying that I believe in organization building isn't meant to detract from those single issue campaigns that exist, achieve as much as they can, and then go away again. They can be an enormous force for progress. But I think organization building is actually pretty good. I mean, the most obvious example of that is things like political parties, you know, left and liberal progressive political parties globally. You know, they exist through time to provide a consistent and ongoing drive for change. And the big NGOs that have existed now for 100 years or so, although they're not as old as many political parties, I think occupy the same role. So I would say organization build, culture build, try to institutionalize your ideas so that they can be carried forward.
Great, thanks for that, Andrew. Audrey, we have a question for you from Toby, which is, I know the Jehovah's Witnesses have a concept of shunning, but how often do faith-to-faithless find people who have lost all contact with family because of their lack of faith?
There's a lot of people out there, and Faith to Faith has come into contact with a lot of people who've lost contact with their families, lost contact with their communities, have moved, and have had to change their whole life because they've come to that conclusion that they're not, they don't want to be part of a faith anymore. They come to that conclusion that they don't believe in the faith that they were raised in. You'd be surprised how prevalent it is. I don't have any figures. I think the issue with people who are considered to be apostates, or who consider themselves to be people who are no longer part of faith, is that they keep it quiet, and so they kind of just poodle along and just try and find spaces to be and be themselves where they can. So there isn't any kind of real figures, but it's so as an organization, you just have to put yourself out there and say, here we are, this is us. And people come at various stages, and sometimes it isn't about immediately leaving that you want to find something else to replace it. Sometimes you need the space. Sometimes you need to heal in other ways. Sometimes you need counseling. Sometimes you need to do other things. Sometimes you just need to find a home and somewhere to live, and all of those things. So it's about finding people at the right stage of that kind of healing process. that they go through. But people, there are so many people out there, and it is about just being present and also being part of those organizations, as I was talking about, being part of social services, being part of the police, being part of those things and making them aware so that they can get support, and then they can move on to come to organizations like Faith to Faithless and just seek the support that they need and just find that common space. It is quite prevalent. It's more prevalent than people really realize.
Right, thanks for that, Audrey. Sasha, very timely question. So question for the whole panel: what is a good way for a young person such as myself to start getting involved with campaigning or humanist campaigning? Jamie, do you want to kick that off with a kind of general campaigning view?
Sure. I think with campaigning, it's important, again, to kind of go off what the answer to the first question was, is to make sure that you don't, you look after yourself, because often the things that we're campaigning about are things that impact us personally anyway. And I think it's really important that you find the balance between putting your campaigner hat on and also personally dealing with you know, the struggles. For example, a lot of my work is about transphobia. It's a lot about public prejudice. It's a lot about institutional prejudice. And obviously, as a trans person, I work within that space and I write on that, but I also exist within it and I am impacted by that. So it can, you know, you need to set really strict boundaries with yourself about what you want to campaign about and how you're going to look after yourself when you do that. I think it's often quite easy for us in the age of social media to see a lot of people, you know, sharing campaigns online. A lot of people that I'm good friends with, for example, Gina Martin, who's an amazing campaigner who added to the Voyeurism Act and got upskirting made illegal after she experienced that. And, you know, she's an amazing example of how online it can look not easy, but it can make it appear in some kind of way. However, behind the scenes, and she's very good at detailing what goes on, is that there is a lot of work that goes on. So I'd say make sure that you are prepared for that work. Obviously, you're not necessarily going to know what you're going into, but I would say research as much as possible, read on the subjects, read about how to make a campaign successful and what could eventually happen, because you don't want to end up going into a situation where, you know, it suddenly gets really a lot of attention and you don't have the tools or allies that, you know, you need to be able to make it achieve its end goal. So that's what I'd say in that instance. Yeah.
Cool. Anyone else want to come in for young people getting involved in humanist campaigning? Join Young Humanists. I mean, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
I would also say make sure it's something. Well, it has to come from a place that you that it's a place that you agree with. It's something that you're quite passionate about. Because it's going to be a long, hard slog, because it's going to be something that can be quite difficult, where obstacles are going to be put in your way, you do need to be, it needs to be something that you're actually really quite passionate about, that you care about, rather than something that's just quite popular or something that's got quite a big, you know, a big voice at the moment. It needs to be, if you're going to start a campaign, it needs to be something that comes from a place that you're comfortable with, where you understand the issues, and so therefore you can start that ball rolling, and other people can come in and think about who you can work with as well. But I think it needs to start from somewhere within you, that you actually think, actually this is something. It may not be something that is totally personal, but something that you really feel quite strongly about, and then that way, when the knocks come, you're a little bit more resilient because you actually still have that passion for it.
My answer would be, I think that there are a lot of ways of campaigning, of being an activist, of getting involved. And I think that it's really important to, when you're thinking about your own possible involvement, realize that you might have lots of different ongoing involvements with lots of different things at the same time. So you might be, as I am, as a lot of people are, I suppose, someone who just makes a subscription and a donation to something, is on their email list, signs their petitions, emails your MP about it, you know, does things like that. And that's really good, by the way. You know, that's amazing. You are more active than the average person if you do those things. But then there'll be other things where you want to have a more personal involvement, where you want to agitate, where you want to go yourself to meet people in power or to initiate activities. And, you know, that's something which, if you've got the time for, as many young people have, you should definitely get involved in. And then there's a third type of thing where I think you're just an activist every day. There is such a thing as conversational activism. There is such a thing as representing opinions to people that you meet, to friends that you have, being by word of mouth, like a representative of your cause or causes, and never, not in a pushy way. I mean, we all know what it's like to be, trapped in the lift with an obsessive of some, or is that just me? I don't know, but you know what I mean, metaphorically. You don't want to beat people over the head with your cause 24 hours a day necessarily, but just living it and being a living advocate for your cause, that can be one of the most powerful things that anyone can do. Personally, what I've made peace with as the years and decades have gone by is that I know that my contribution to a lot of causes is of that type. Is of just a very, maybe I'll never even see the impact of the actions that I have, but just by like trying to pass the message on different issues that I'm interested in, and with the people that I meet, the people, my family, my friends, the people I know, I think that could be very powerful overall, because they are the building blocks. Those little interactions in the small places of our lives are the building blocks that build the sort of cultural change, which I said at the beginning is necessary for any realistic policy change to ever occur. So, I think it's important to recognize there are so many ways of being part of a change.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I used to run the LGBT network at my company, and many a poor soul has been trapped in a 20-minute conversation about a trans right with me at the pubs and been unable to escape. The next question is from Victor. So, question for the panel, or maybe for yourself, Andrew, given you look after Humanist International. What would be a good first step in creating a humanist association in a country where none exists?
I'm going to email the reply to that in the chat, because there's a simple answer, which is email the amazing Giovanni,
fabulous,
who at Humanist International, who will give you the resource pack that you need. So I'll put Giovanni's email address in the chat.
Great. Nothing if not efficient. A question from Fred. So question for Andrew. How can we differentiate between tolerance and cultural diversity in our society on the one hand, and being ignorant and careless about human rights, especially about child abuse under the name of faith, and rituals such as child marriage, fasting, and circumcision on the other hand? So how do we make that kind of often quite emotive conversation feel balanced and fair?
Is this a question that's written down here as well?
Yes, Fred. From Fred.
Well, I personally have been, ever since I first encountered it, probably at the age of 18, which is a lot of years ago now, I personally have always been an advocate of the human rights framework in making sense of these sorts of issues. I think that although human rights are, just an idea, they're a cultural product of many generations of hard, ideological work by human beings. There's nothing natural about them. They are a construct, but as a framework, I find human rights are the best way I've ever encountered to make sense of both our individual needs and also our obligations to each other. And so I think that I would start from that point of view on almost every question that was asked. So that's an abstract answer, because this is a question that is sort of halfway between the abstract and the very concrete. Make maybe. How about, Fred? You try and rephrase your question to be very concrete. Like, give a specific example. So, for example, if children are abused by being forced into marriage, or being mutilated in various ways, or having even medical operations on them without their consent when they're in a position to meaningfully consent, then obviously that's something which one's own right to dignity and to privacy would militate against. So, female genital mutilation, obvious example, and forced marriage, another obvious example. These are things which no individual should be put through by another human being. Why? Because they, the child in question, are bearers of human rights, which in our law are inalienable. The right to physical integrity being one, for example. So that's the way that I would go about it. And I've never found a problem that isn't amenable to the human rights framework to be solved in some way, because the human rights framework is so comprehensive. It contains all the things that you would want to see, right to family life, a right to private life, the right not to be tortured, the right to life, full stop, the right not to be discriminated against on any ground in the enjoyment of those rights, the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of belief, the right to freedom of thought, and the right not to be discriminated against has become, of course, so important as it's drawn in so many different new categories of discrimination that might be possible. People being discriminated against because of their gender identity, people being discriminated against because of their sexual orientation. These are new factors, legally new factors, I mean, but that have found themselves able to be accommodated within the human rights framework. And I think that speaks to the dynamic flexibility of the human rights framework, that because it is about every person and their rights, it can be applied in almost every difficult situation. So that's the framework that I would use. And it's never let me down, or at least not yet.
Thanks for that, Andrew. So a question for you, Audrey and Jamie. What have been, from Toby, so what have been some of the more frustrating conversations and confrontations you've had whilst campaigning? And I'll kind of add a positive note to that, when kind of how did you get around it, or how did you deal with it? Do you want to kick us off, Audrey?
I think the frustrating thing is when you're dealing with, I never try to argue with people about religious points, so obviously, but after you've had a long conversation, people have looked at you and they said, oh, I understand what you're saying, yeah, I can see what they, and then they end it with, I'll pray for you, which is the most annoying thing ever. You don't get around it, you just kind of go, yeah. And sometimes it isn't about, it's just about accepting that people are going to be who they are. But you would have, what I always say is, I try and plant a seed. You just trying to say, and as Andrew was saying, you're just having those conversations. And it is frustrating when you're trying to do something and people are set in their ways, rather than because they can see any differences, but because it's just the way that things have always been done. And when we were talking about cultural change, when you're dealing with African community, when you're dealing with the Caribbean community, or any of those kinds of conservative, it's because it's always been that way. It's not because there's any kind of reason. So when you're trying to use reason in a situation like that, you have to recognize that may be not the way to go forward. And that can be very frustrating when trying to work around it, in terms of just trying to, and not to, but just to kind of pick a thing of saying, well, actually, what I'm going to do in this conversation is say my piece. Yeah, and somebody may be listening, or people may remember it a little way back, 2 weeks from now, 2 years from now, someone will remember that actually Audrey said something about this. Let me have a conversation. Let me think about it in a different way. And it isn't always about trying to change something immediately. It's about just planting those seeds and then not getting frustrated. Let it go. Whatever it is, let it go. You know what I mean? You will drive yourself insane if you hold on to everything that's been said, and you know what I mean? Just let it go and move on to the next thing, because your own sanity is much more important.
Great advice. Jamie, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of my biggest issues when it comes to not necessarily just campaigning, but in terms of my, when I vocally speak about trans issues, is that often the message becomes very sanitized, because people will approach me. For example, last December, I did a talk for TEDx London, where I spoke about the need for empathy and allyship from people, despite the fact that they might not understand certain issues. It's like imperative that, the trans community right now needs your allyship. And after, there was a section where essentially like a meet and greet, and I had so many people kind of coming up to me and being like, I really appreciate what you said, but and they took the message, they sanitized the message, and they took it right back to the beginning, like, but what does trans mean? But what does non-binary mean? And they completely kind of almost gaslight you, because they make you think that you're being confusing, and they make you think that you're alienating people by just standing up for the message. So I'd say, in that instance, what I like to do when people ask those questions, or when people are frustrating and kind of try and unfairly criticize your campaign, is to flip the question back onto them. So when people are asking me, how can I be a better ally? I would always reply with, how do you think you're a kind person, or how would you be a kinder person? Because that's essentially what the question is. And then when you flip it back to them in layman's terms, they're like, oh, okay. They realize that although we are differently identified through our gender, our race, our ability, all of these types of things, we all do have human ways to interact with each other and to care for each other and be compassionate. And I think that's really important to remember when you're in a frustrating state.
Definitely. Empathy is key. Thanks for that, Jamie. We have a question from Charlotte Woodworth, who couldn't make the event, but I think is involved in the Liverpool local branch of Humanist UK, and has sent in a question via email. So it's very long, so I will paraphrase, but basically one for you, Andrew, I think. Is local humanism the way to push campaigns forward? A lot of talk around humanism can be quite kind of academic or philosophical. Should we be doing more kind of local area things, more walks, coffee morning, social, food bank, community type stuff? Is Humanist UK focused on that? And how can we do more of it?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely, I think it's the bit toward the end of this question, I think is the really key part, which is that, as Charlotte says, often people are warmer to your message if they've had a pleasant interaction with you previously. And I find this all the time talking to parliamentarians. Members of parliament very often are people who are active in their communities. They know a lot of people there. They go to a lot of events. Almost always, they've been to a humanist funeral, and had some contact, for example, with the type of work that our celebrants do. And even if they're at complete odds with you politically in all sorts of ways, or they're a bit dubious about your agenda, as members of parliament sometimes are, you can normally connect with them on that basis. They have had a good interaction with your organization or your movement. One of your people has been there at a time that they felt really hard and found it really hard, and they've taken something away from it that's positive. So I think that point that Charlotte makes, that if someone says, can identify with humanists as the people who have done X, Y, or Z in my local area, or that I have, interacted with in that positive way, then they're more likely to be amenable to the messages that you're trying to give to them in terms of the campaign goals that you want to adopt. So I think that's very important. As to whether that's a local national split, I don't know. I mean, I have in my last 15 years with Humanist UK been to some local groups whose meetings have been really substantially more academic and dry than our national events and national programs. So I wouldn't say that necessarily the local national dichotomy was the same as the academic proactive community oriented dichotomy. But I do absolutely agree that to do things locally, to be involved locally, to contribute to community at the local level, and to be identified as humanists in doing so is definitely one of the ways, not only of achieving a humanist goal in itself, but of warming people to the messages that we have on those other grounds. So I completely agree. And Liverpool has been a great example of getting that happening, of course.
Great, thanks for that.
James is asking, in an age of entrenched identity politics, some practical suggestions to communicate across those cleavages. I don't know if am I being really out of order in extending this? I'm not trying to get it myself. I just thought it'd be really
How
interesting.
dare you, Andrew?
Do you mind?
I will allow the question.
We've got a couple of minutes. I'd be really interested, Jamie, in order to answer to that, because it is true, is entrenched identity politics, and the question of how in your campaigning you've reached beyond that or tried to reach beyond it is very interesting to me.
Politics at the moment is it's just a crazy thing. I think we haven't engaged with it in any real way. It's because it's about, what are your aims? What are you trying to do? What is your message? And stay focused on that and not try and get drawn into all of the other things. I think as a Black woman, you know what I mean? There's a whole range of stuff that gets thrown up, and there's an idea of how I should be, where I should be, what I should be saying as a Black woman, what parts of the Black, you know what I mean? I was just talking recently, it's Black History Month, and I'm kind of like, I'm Black History Month enough. Do you know what I mean? I've had Black History Month. It's been going on and you know what I mean? As Black people, what do we do? How do we move on from this? And you know, there's a kind of comeback to that to say, you know, this is our month. And I'm like, you know, I'm black all year. Let's move on from that. And I think things have to have their time. So sometimes you just have to take the slings and arrows, but stay true but not kind of get caught up in all of those kinds of different narratives. Understand your own narrative and then kind of go, I'm not going down that route with you because it doesn't actually take me anywhere. But you just have to be clear. And I know that when I walk into any space and I'm the only black woman, the only face, the black face, or the only woman in a space, you just have to know, well, who am I in this space? What is it that I represent? But also understand what the message is that other people are trying to create and what they are trying to achieve. And just try and understand, you know, it is a tightrope. Some days I have to work out, you know, who am I today and what things are going to be thrown at me today. And then once I kind of work out which hats or, you know what I mean, where I fit into this space, and I think, you know what I mean, then I can move on. You do just have to be clear about who you are. And it takes strength sometimes. Some days, you know what I mean, some days I don't want to be the only black person. Sometimes I don't want to be any of those things. I don't want any of those labels. I want to turn up, do what I need to do and go. But some days I have to wear a hat. And so I kind of have to decide what hat I'm going to wear and not get drawn into those things and allow people to have their opinions and understand and know this is my opinion. This is why my opinion is mine, and kind of just put it forward and then put up that shield, turn into Wonder Woman and do my thing, because it can get a bit tough out there. But I'm good. I'm good.
So you're definitely Wonder Woman to us, Audrey. Jamie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd say, I think James's question, in terms of identity politics, I kind of put a lot of middle fingers up to this kind of notion of identity politics, because although my identity is inherently political, it's not my choice that it's political. It's just, it is political because it's silenced. So I think that's a good one for the Twitter, if you want to take that out. I think, you know, it can feel aggressive, and I think often for people that are, you know, I always misquote this quote, but there's that quote that's like, you know, when the privileged are, or when the less privileged are given rights, the privileged feel like things are being taken away. And I think often that comes into this discussion with identity politics, as people are like, oh, why can't things just go back to the normal, or why all these new things? And it's actually like, well, these aren't new. You know, trans identities are not new in any facet of the world. And it's just that we've been given more opportunities to discuss things, and we're having more accessibility to language and more accessibility to campaigning and to change. In terms of practical suggestions to communicate across a cleavage, I would say that, you know, for me as a child here, I and a lot of people that I know, we do use social media to actively campaign on issues. I set up the campaign that I did for passports solely through social media, through Instagram, and we got, you know, nearly 30,000 signatures. So it is achievable. Gina Martin, again, her campaign was done predominantly through social media and print and digital media, and she changed the law. So it is completely feasible. I'd say Instagram's a good one because it's fun. Twitter can be a bit of a barrage of abuse. And I think as long as you curate a community of people that will be allies to you in that campaign on your social media, wherever you do it is fine. Just make sure you've got the right people with you.
Amazing. Thanks for that. And thanks to all of our speakers. Thanks for everyone for attending. So thanks, Andrew, Jamie, and Audrey. If you like what you've seen today and you want to see a bit more, then I've lost my notes. Andrew has his book, The Little Book of Humanism, which is out now. And Jamie's book, In Their Shoes, Navigating Non-Binary Life, comes out tomorrow. So what a great excuse to go on Amazon right now and buy it. We do have some other events coming up. So if you are interested in the work of Humanist students or Humanists UK, then you want to get involved, then please do. I've posted the link in the chat at humanism.org.uk/student. You can join Humanists UK. It's completely free if you're a student. If you're not a student, there are low income options available. And we'll send you a kind of fetching welcome pack with a pin badge and bookmarks and a load of materials about the work that Humanists UK have done, as well as kind of regular information about our campaigns and opportunities to come along to our discussion events, much like this, and get involved in our different campaigns as they arise.